He did not ask because he expected a large number. He asked because the form required a number, any number, and the coalition had learned over 4,000 years of admissions interviews that the field was almost always zero. Administrator Theskor asked the question the way a customs officer asks whether you are carrying fruit. Colonel Amara Voss, retired, now Chief Human Liaison to the Coalition Intake Bureau, looked at the question on the shared display, looked at him, and asked if he wanted to sit down first. He did not sit down. That was his first mistake of the day. The Intake Bureau's admission form ran 11 pages, translated into English by a linguistic model that had clearly never encountered sarcasm, and it treated every species the same way a hospital intake form treats every patient, with a flat procedural indifference that was its own kind of insult. Under historical conflict disclosure, the form asked for total recorded losses attributable to the applicant species, self-inflicted or otherwise, expressed as an integer. Theskor explained, not unkindly, that the field existed to flag species with ongoing internal instability, the kind that made for unreliable trade partners. Most applicants entered a number in the low thousands. One species, the vel, had entered 0, and the Bureau had used their file as the training example for 3 centuries. Theskor wore the pale gray robes of the intake service, 412 interviews in, still creased at the collar the way new fabric stays creased when a species has never needed to learn how to slouch. Spoke English with the rounded, over-careful precision of someone who had learned it from audio archives rather than conversation, and smiled the way people smile at children filling out their first form. "It is a formality," he said again when Voss did not immediately type a number. "We ask everyone, round to the nearest 1,000 is acceptable." Voss had spent 11 years commanding a joint task force before she'd spent the next 9 commanding a negotiating table, and in both jobs she had learned the same lesson. The moment before someone realizes they are wrong is the only moment worth watching closely. She watched Theskor's face while she typed. She did not round. The number appeared on the shared display in the Bureau's own formatting, black text on pale blue, exactly like every other number on every other page of the form. Theskor read it. He read it again because the translation software offered no error message and his mind was searching for one. Then he set down the stylus he had been holding because his hand had stopped being useful for anything. "That cannot be a total loss figure," he said. "That must be a population figure." "It's the other field," Voss said. "The one under it, 2 world wars 1 century before we'd left the atmosphere. I didn't include the ones after since you asked for historical, not current." The room the Bureau used for intake interviews was small by design, meant to feel informal, 2 chairs and a low table, and a window showing a rotating orbital view of whichever world was being processed. Behind Voss sat her 2 aides, a logistics officer named Priya Osai, whose doctoral committee had once accused her of writing military logistics reports like combat forecasts, which she had taken as a compliment, and a translator named Iset Anand, both silent, both trained not to react on camera, both failing slightly at that in the first 10 seconds. Osai had once written a doctoral thesis arguing that human military history should be classified as a form of applied engineering, a paper her committee had called alarmist and unpublishable. She was not writing anymore. She was watching Theskor's hands. "There must be a translation error," Theskor said, and his perfect English had acquired for the first time a very small crack in it, the sound of a man reading his own script and finding it does not match the room. "The Bureau's models are calibrated for. They're calibrated for species that fight each other in the low thousands," Voss said. "We're not that, we were never that, I'm not proud of the number, I'm not ashamed of it either. It's just what it costs a species to learn how to stop doing that to itself, on a planet with no one to teach you otherwise." This was the line the whole file would later be built around. The one line the Bureau's own historians would eventually quote back to Voss in rooms far larger than this one. She had not planned to say it. She had planned going in to give the Bureau exactly what the form asked for and nothing else. But watching Theskor's careful, condescending kindness curdle into something closer to fear, she understood that the form had never been built to process an answer like this one, because no species that survived long enough to reach orbit had ever needed to answer it honestly before. Theskor did not finish the interview that hour. He excused himself, cited a technical review, and left the room with the stylus still on the table where he had set it down. What happened over the next 11 days inside the Coalition Intake Bureau was not visible to Voss directly, but it was visible in its effects, the way weather is visible in what it does to trees. Requests for supplementary data arrived hourly, then every 20 minutes. A senior archivist named Sohn Petrick, 3 ranks above Theskor, was assigned to the human file and immediately requested every scrap of recorded conflict history Earth had digitized, going back to accounts of siege warfare, then further, until the requests read less like an admissions review and more like triage. Osai was the one who noticed what the requests actually revealed. She had spent 4 years being told her thesis was alarmist, and she read the Bureau's request logs the way a woman reads a document that finally agrees with her. "They're not asking what we did," she told Voss on the 9th day, sitting on the floor of the liaison office because her legs had stopped wanting to hold her up through the shock of being right. "They're asking how fast we industrialized doing it. Look at the timestamps. They went from asking about total losses to asking about production rates in 6 hours. They're not scared of the number, they're scared of the slope." The slope, it turned out, was the actual discovery, the thing under the thing. Every species in the Coalition's 4,000-year admissions record had reached orbit slowly, over centuries of careful, low-conflict accumulation, because species that fought hard enough to industrialize war also tended to fight hard enough to extinguish themselves before they finished building a rocket. Humanity had done both in the same 100 years. It had built the engines of its worst century and the engines that left the atmosphere out of the same factories, sometimes the same week, and it had kept both capacities intact afterward instead of losing one to acquire the other. The Bureau had a category for species that industrialized peace. It had no category for a species that had industrialized everything at once and survived being good at all of it simultaneously. They said Anne End found the second discovery, quieter than the first but heavier. Translating a Bureau internal memo she was not supposed to have access to, she found the actual metric the intake service used to rank applicant threat level, a single field called recovery interval, the average time a species took to rebuild after its worst recorded conflict. The Coalition average was 140 years. Humanity's interval, calculated from the end of its bloodiest century to the completion of its first permanent orbital station, was 31 years. "They don't process how a species can lose that much and still be standing this fast," Annan said. "The form doesn't have a field for it, I checked. There's a blank space where the number should generate a category and it's just blank." There was a third discovery, smaller than the other two but stranger, and it belonged to a junior bureau clerk named Farunbal rank. Provisional Archive Assistant, 3rd class, a title the Bureau had never once had reason to use in a Defense Council document before this one, who had no business being included in a Defense Council briefing at all, except that he was the only person in the building who had actually read the human file end to end, instead of skimming for the number everyone else was already discussing. He found it in a footnote of a footnote, a translated fragment from an old human record about a single winter campaign, and he did the thing none of his superiors had done. He cross-referenced the resource figures against the casualty figures and noticed that the ratio made no sense by any Coalition model of sustained conflict. Species that fought that hard for that long were supposed to run out of material, or will, or both, long before they ran out of people willing to keep going. Humanity had, by his math, run out of neither. He took his findings to Sohn Petrick expecting to be dismissed, and instead watched the senior archivist go very still for a long moment before asking him to repeat the calculation twice more, out loud, slowly, as if hearing it again might change the answer. On the 12th day, the ticking clock arrived, and it arrived in the Bureau's own devastating dialect of politeness. A formal communication, sealed with the 7-ring authority mark of the Coalition Defense Council rather than the Intake Bureau, informed the human delegation that in light of newly disclosed capability profile inconsistent with peaceful admission criteria, a containment escort of Coalition vessels would arrive at Sol system within 40 hours to verify the stability of the applicant species prior to any further processing. The word verify appeared 4 times in a document that was, structurally, an ultimatum wearing a lab coat. Voss read it twice, standing at the window, and felt not fear but recognition, the flat calm of watching an argument she had already had internally get made out loud by someone else. "They're not coming to negotiate," she said. "They're coming to see if the number was a bluff." She turned to Osai. "How fast can the defense grid go from monitoring posture to full engagement system-wide?" 14 minutes, Osai said. "We built it for the interval kernel. That's the whole point of the number they're scared of." The Coalition escort arrived on schedule, 11 vessels dropping out of transit at the edge of Sol's outer detection ring, arranged in the loose, unhurried formation of a force that expected to be observing, not fighting. What they had not accounted for, because the Bureau's own historical models had never had to account for it, was that the same species that built the recovery interval had also built a defense architecture designed by people who assumed the next threat would arrive without warning, because every threat in its history had. Sol's orbital grid did not scramble. It had never been asleep. Sol's grid was not a single system but a layered one, built over 3 decades by engineers who had grown up being told correctly that the last century of relative peace was an anomaly and not a guarantee. The outer ring carried passive sensor buoys spaced at intervals calculated to catch a transit signature before it fully resolved. The middle ring carried the interceptor swarms, individually cheap, collectively expensive, designed on the assumption that any single unit was disposable and no engagement could be allowed to depend on one. The inner ring, closest to Earth and closest to the old orbital stations that had once been nothing more than a proof of concept, carried the Gravwell countermeasure arrays that had never, in 30 years, been used against anything but simulated targets. Voss had walked the inner ring twice during her active years, back when it was still mostly empty steel waiting for a war nobody wanted and everybody built for anyway. The engagement lasted 6 minutes and 40 seconds, start to formal coalition withdrawal, and it was decided in the first 90 of those seconds by a single decision Voss had authorized 8 days earlier, the moment OSI explained the slope. Human tracking arrays, tuned during the interview period specifically to the frequency signatures the Bureau's own escort ships had transmitted during approach clearance, 3 days prior, locked onto all 11 vessels before they'd finished their formation check. 4 coalition ships attempted a coordinated Gravwell maneuver, a maneuver the Bureau's own combat doctrine considered unbeatable against a species without prior exposure to the technology. Human interceptor drones, cheap, mass-produced, and individually expendable, matched the maneuver's harmonic pattern within 11 seconds. Because Annan's translation work had already handed the defense grid the exact engineering specification, buried 3 layers deep in a memo about recovery intervals nobody at the Bureau had thought to classify. 2 coalition ships took disabling fire to their drive sections and went dark. 1 ship, faster to adapt than the rest, broke formation and attempted a genuine evasive retreat, and Voss gave the order to let it go untouched, because a species assessing whether to trust you should be allowed to watch you choose not to finish something you could finish. The remaining 8 vessels transmitted formal withdrawal within 4 minutes of first contact. No human vessel fired on a target that had already gone dark. No human vessel pursued the retreating ship. The engagement ended not because either side ran out of capability, but because one side had, for the first time in 4,000 years of admissions history, run out of assumptions. Afterward, the analysis teams would spend weeks describing the 6 minutes and 40 seconds in language Voss found almost funny, calling it decisive, overwhelming, a demonstration. She thought of it differently, standing on the observation deck while the last coalition transit signature faded from the outer ring. It was not a demonstration. It was homework already done 30 years old, filed away by people who had hoped never to need it and built it anyway because hope was not a defense architecture. The grid had not been built for this specific Tuesday. It had been built for every Tuesday, indefinitely, by a species that had learned the hard way what happens to the ones who stop building on the good years. Thescor's official communication arrived through Bureau channels 6 hours later, formal, sealed, and useless, informing the human delegation that the intake review would resume pending further study. Voss did not respond to it. She was waiting for the other one. It came that night, unsealed, sent from a personal terminal rather than a Bureau channel, and it began with 11 full seconds of silence before Thescor spoke at all. A detail Voss noticed only because she had left the audio running while she worked through OSI's revised threat assessment on the other half of the display. "I have processed 412 admissions interviews," he said finally. "I assumed your species would be defined by the number you gave me. I was wrong about which number mattered. It was never the count. It was the interval." Another pause, shorter this time. "That is an audacious thing to have survived. I did not have a category for it. I am building one now and I would like your help naming it if you're willing to speak with me again as something other than a formality." Voss did not answer that night either. She was already 3 pages into a proposal she had started the moment the withdrawal order came through, a document that had nothing to do with the admissions form and everything to do with what came after it. A trade framework built around exactly the capability the Bureau had just spent 12 days being terrified of. OSI found her still working past midnight station time, the orbital window behind her showing Earth instead of the rotating world the Bureau usually displayed. Someone having quietly swapped the feed hours ago and never told her. "You're not writing a response to his apology," OSI said. "He doesn't need one yet," Voss said, not looking up. "He needs to see what we do with the 31 years next, not what we say about the 100 we already survived." She kept typing. That's the part they still don't have a category for. The proposal she was building was not a rebuttal to the admissions form. It was a replacement for it, drafted overnight with OSI slope data and Annan's interval math folded into the first 3 pages, and it did not ask the Bureau to forgive a number. It asked them to stop measuring the wrong one. Every species that had ever applied for coalition membership had been ranked by how little damage it had done to itself. Voss's draft proposed a second axis entirely, one that measured how fast a species returned to building things after it had every reason to stop, and it offered Earth's own file, unredacted, as the founding data point. She wrote the framework the way she had once written after-action reports, in short sentences with no adjectives she could not defend, and she left space at the end of the document for a name the Bureau had not chosen yet, because Thescor had asked to help choose it, and she intended to hold him to that. By the time Farunbal's footnote made it into an official Bureau briefing 3 weeks later, cited without irony as the moment the intake service first understood what it was actually looking at, Voss had already stopped thinking about the interview that started it. She was thinking about the next one, the one with the trade delegation, the one where the number on the form would not be a kill count at all, but a production figure, and she intended that one to be just as honest as the first, and just as hard to file under any category the Bureau had built before meeting her.